Welcome to the May 2024 Executive Committee of the New York City Board of Ed Retirement System. Today is Thursday, May 30th, and the time is 12:09. Please be reminded that the committee meetings is being recorded and will be posted to the BERS YouTube channel. I will begin with the meeting by calling the roll. John Matter. Present. Donald Nesbitt, present. Greg Faulkner. Anthony Giordano.
Present and accounted for.
Karina Pollock.
Present.
We have a quorum. I would also like to note for the record that alternate executive committee members. Frank is here. Frank is here. Frank Sarabella, Maisha Sapp is here.
Sorry. I'm here, I'm not an observer,
Yes.
just the observer today.
John Dorsey is here as a designee for the New York City Controller, Landa. Now, agenda item 1 is to consider the minutes from the April 18th Executive Committee meeting, a summary of which was included in your packages sent prior to the meeting. May I have a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
So move, Tony Giordano, second, John Matterich. You have a second. Any discussion on those minutes? Any discussion on those minutes? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please indicate by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. We have several agenda items for today's meeting. And again, there are no contract related items. So we will skip straight to agenda item number 3 with a brief training on liability risk management by investment lead Salil Mehta. Salil? Well, we need a motion to consider. No, we don't. Salil?
Thank you. If anyone online cannot see the screen, let me know by voicing, because we won't be able to see hand signals and things from here. So this is a reintroduction to liability risk modeling. It's an in-depth topic which I covered about a year ago, but it's helpful to revisit that topic over time, especially to see changes in the portfolio and how the model has worked against it, and why it's important as trustees to look at this particular perspective on the portfolio and what it means for people who are the beneficiaries of the pension. So the first is, at a very high level, why and how do we look at liability risks? It seems like something that some folks say is very difficult to sort of connect with the pension, especially in the work that happens on the asset side. So there's many reasons. Among those reasons are that markets are not multi-normally distributed vehicles. So you have major asset classes, you have stocks, you have bonds, private equity, and so forth, and none of them individually or collectively are what we call normally distributed. And a normal distribution has a certain shape. You've heard of the term, it's a bell curve. And often it's helpful to use that assumption because the math that goes into a lot of asset allocation, the traditional theoretical models would assume that to be the case, but we know that that's not necessarily true. Also, we have something that we look at within pensions, which is the model risk, which is the measuring of and modeling of newer and different asset classes or special cases that we have. Also, we have cash flow reserving processes that impact future member benefits and confidence. And I've talked to folks along the way about how you can have two very similar types of returns, even very similar ratios when it comes to funding. But if the underlying processes are different in the reserving, then the people who are the members of BERS, they may have less confidence, or if you have less confidence in the pension, you may feel less confident about your employer. And you could think of things as, well, Social Security, for example, we know that our parents may be receiving Social Security, but we also internally feel that there's less confidence that we ourselves may get the same type of benefit in the future, even though there's no guarantee we're not going to get nothing either. But, we want to keep track of the funding situation as well. If you want more information, especially on the mathematical nuances and all this, we have the website here from the prior executive committee from a year ago, which it's like a 45-minute in-depth move. But here I just want to talk more about just reintroducing the concepts, and then at a later point in the year, talking about modeling results, especially as we cross over the fiscal year. So with New York City, for the BERS plan for the asset allocation, we integrated the staff views on modeling against funding and reserve matchups. And I'll talk about sort of an explanation and give an example of that. We also, with liability risk modeling, look at path dependencies over a much longer horizon. So one example of that is when you look at just on the asset side, you may not care over a 2-year period, for example, whether you get 10% one year and 0 the next year versus 0 the first year and 10 the next year. At the end of 2 years, you're exactly the same. But from a liability perspective, it's a very different situation, which order you get those streams. It's not that how you net out in the end, because the underlying calculations for both reserving and the funding will change quite a bit depending on that. So you want to model sort of the differences in probabilities of having different pathways. Now, this work has been done in the industry. I've done it at a place Sandy and I worked at a long time ago, and we've done it at BERS previously. But we also are able to unbias bidirectional cash flows from specific asset classes, and so take that into account. And also use something called PCA, the principal component analysis, something Effie brought up when he was first a trustee, and he actually sat in my office last week. I went through this over him as well. But using principal component analysis to better isolate what are the explanatory information that drives the asset. So if you see specific types of returns, which I'll show on the next slide, you can actually sort of describe what are the underlying factors a little more closely. We look at joint tail risk and actually model that completely. So you're not looking at arbitrary shock events from the past, but things that happened, say, a couple of years ago, where you had stocks and bonds both have fair markets at the same time. If you had assumed that both of them operate normally and are inversely correlated in some sense, that would be a very rare event. But if you model them in a way that sort of takes into account that these events can happen jointly and in extreme ways more often, it would not be as rare of an event to see that type of year that we had. These insights are actually being peer reviewed right now, a very advanced stage of that. And so it's actually adding to the knowledge base in the industry, this type of book. So I show some examples here. Now, I have a set of different portfolio sort of options here on the right. What I show in the middle ground is really kind of what's the standard market average sort of in the industry. And it shows sort of don't take these as specific point values because none of them actually represent BERS, but you can see that this is generally what you see in a public pension plan, the type of distributed weights in fixed income, 26%, 48% in equities, and the sub weights that add up to 48%, and then alts. You can have a different portfolio, for example, on the column that's on the right, that's a little more slanted towards alts, offsetting equity, or you can go the other way, which is what would have been optimal from a liability risk standpoint, which goes a little less into alts, more to say U.S. equities, and so forth. The thing here is that all three of the sort of the spectrum that you see here have typically similar return standard deviation characteristics. So if you have a capital markets line or where you were on the efficient frontier, they're very similar, but you can get to that end state in very different ways. And you can have different stakeholders who want sort of different sort of positioning from how they look at it from asset allocation. What I wanted to highlight here is that we can do this in a collaborative way, which is what we did last year. And we're able to make adjustments that different stakeholders wanted and still get the results that focused on minimizing liability risk. So a couple examples, there was a suggestion, I think it was from BAM to consolidate real estate, the two sub-asset classes of core and non-core into one, remove TIPS. That's another one. And we're easily able to accommodate that and still focus on the sort of the principal components of what we wanted. And we never wanted being on either extreme. But the reason we couldn't go to a place that was even more higher in private markets, for example, is because that BERS was uniquely overweight in that asset class relative to other pensions. We're just overweight on where it was, and we were able to sort of take that in just a little bit for a short while, not forever. And if you look at what the returns have been over the last year, and we've seen this in a number of different ways, private markets have been flat, and the U.S. stock market has gone up around 14%. So it was the right call to sort of want to be a little bit more into U.S. equities, a little less in privates for our specific situation. But kind of, if we fast forward to where we are today, the general direction of funding, as I've mentioned to folks and trustees I've talked to over the course of the year, it's been hampered by what we're seeing in the private markets over the last year. So the funding, of course, is an accounting calculation that happens at the end of every fiscal year. So it is simply just that, what that calculation is. For BERS, the funding ratios typically move 15% plus or minus in any given year. That's for us. That's not true necessarily for the industry, but we have some unique characteristics in our plan. And it's a little bit on the higher side. For the modeling work from the actual and from sort of minimizing liability risk, the model results, both inside the model as well as the results that we've seen in the year since, are a little bit lower on what's the expected funding ratio deviations of around 12.5%. So it's actually an improvement from the perspective of what you're going to see from funding ratio risk, contribution risk, things like that. We all know that the fiscal year to date performance, and the fiscal year is almost done, has been good. It's been good for everyone. The markets has gone up. Like I said, stocks are at all-time highs and so forth. Our portfolio will be over the 7% assumed rate. It's pretty hard not to be above 7%, regardless of how you've sorted out your asset allocation. But we still do have the back amortization that's weighing down on the funding ratio from losses from the previous years, from the stock market, bond market, and the slower return in privates. That does not get valued right away. That's part of the actual adjustment, the reserve and so forth. So we still have a little bit of weight from that. And I've mentioned throughout the year that we will glacially move up on our funding ratio just from the fact that we're above that 7%. And so does the rest of the industry. But the funding ratio has a handful of adjustments, and portfolio market deviations account for only 2 of, say, 5. There's still other important ones that do sort of contribute in reasonable ways. Now, we do have a large actual adjustment over the last 1 year. It's from the accrued actual liabilities that have increased, and it's disconnected from what you're going to see with open enrollment. That's sort of the present value of what's the net future benefits that you pay for, like the new folks. But from that, we can expect the funding ratio, even though we started the fiscal year in the mid 90% range, it may actually come down. We'll get the final numbers, but there is some what I'm mentioning is there are some weights on our specific plan and kind of what's happening in there. And so, you know, when some of us, when I joined, when some of the trustees joined, the funding ratio was over 120%. And so we've come down a little bit. The rest of the industry is coming up a little bit, but we're still high. But I just want to put some perspective on kind of the work we've done, what we've expected, and what we're seeing. These are some of the contribution risks, for example. And this is work that I've worked on with Merrick. We've gone through this. This is, if you forward 10 years, starting last year. And there's different ways to show different types of returns. But I'm going to just stand up briefly just to kind of show you that these are billions of dollars. So what's your annual employer contribution? So there's 2 risks. So on the funding side, you pay for your reserves, both from employees have to pay to be part of the BERS pension. You just don't get it for free. You have to pay a certain amount. There's some risk over time with that. On the employer side, there'll be a contribution. That's where the bigger risk will be if you underperform in a pension. So there's a range of risk here. Right now, we're around 300 million that we pay, in employer contributions. You get to a steady state a decade into the future of around 400 million, but there's a large uncertainty around it. It depends on what you get in your returns. The larger your returns in the pension, the less you have to pay, and the less you sort of have to assume suffer from cash flow risk. But the lower your returns, if you kind of get that over a longer period of time, the more you have to pay, or the benefits have to come some other way in order to balance out the pension. So you have an entire distribution of returns, and this is just the outer 5%, just to focus in on that risk. And what I show in the pink here is if you have, say, a higher risk portfolio that does not take into account liability risk, regardless of how you get to that destination, seeing the pathways along the way, you would get you'd still be at around 400 million, but the risk, you can see, you can have an event that's 1 billion, 1.5 billion event. But if you're taking into account liability risk, you get to a silhouette, which is a little bit closer in. And you're just looking at different critical values and saying, are you willing to tolerate that? And what's the sort of percent reduction you can get in risk to a plan and want to minimize it? So this is for 2033. Can you just press the space bar? Yeah. So this is, can you press the left button?
There it is.
Okay, so this is 10 years later. So this is 20 years in the future. And you can see as you go out further in time, the cone of uncertainty of your outcomes increases. So what was originally a very small couple percentage probability event happening comes in this range of, so if you weren't doing this type of modeling, you could be happy with the central outcome, but still be looking at an exposure of risk that could be somewhere around 5 to 6% chance of being in a position where some of us may not be here, but we could be having a very large contribution risk to balance the pension. And the only way to balance the pension, unless you go into other like tier benefit reductions. So what's it? So it's but what we've done, we've taken it from 5% to 3%.
John.
John. So isn't the single largest liability is the inability of the obligator to make a payment because it's guaranteed under Article 7 of the state constitution, right? So what you're arguing here is that at some point the obligators are not going to be able to pay in, and that we should go to that the board should go to Albany and request another tier. Is that what you're saying? Because I don't think that's anything that I don't think that's anything that
That is not, that's not what he's saying.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
What he's saying is that
understand that because
what Salil's modeling is attempting to do is to identify very bad outcomes out in the future that we wish to avoid by setting asset allocations that avoid them, right? And the complication of that analysis is 1, we're leveraged 28%. 2, we're negative cash flow 2% currently, going to 5% in the next 6 years, which is extraordinarily negative thing for a public pension system. And we want to make sure that we don't have the problem where the city is forced to contribute a hell of a lot more than they expected, because that'll trigger tier 7, tier 8, tier 10.
Well, and I think that we all want to avoid.
We
that.
want to avoid that.
So
This
that's
work
why I'm
is to
trying to
avoid that.
understand this exercise, because I don't see the.
There's two different things. You want to avoid the contribution risk, but with that comes other ways of expressing the same risk. You could say, when these events happen, you also have a sub 60% funding ratio or other things that are possible, they're not impossible to happen. There's no full re-up like I said, we went from 120 to 90% in a very short period of time. Now, you can't say that such things are, possible.
That's without auto enrollment, that's without other,
What does auto enrollment have to do with funding ratio?
you're gonna have more people paying into the plan.
Yeah, but you're also increasing what's.
I mean, you're gonna have more people paying into
No,
the
the
plan.
funding ratio
Wait,
is
hold on. You're gonna have more people paying into the plan. As salaries go up, a larger percentage of what they pay will be going into the plan, correct?
The funding ratio is an accounting of.
It's about 20% of the funding obligation though.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is, as salaries are going up, right? And remember, this is members are contributing to this plan, it's their plan just as much
That's
as anybody else.
The actuary keeps that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not, that Merrick, if Merrick was here, he would tell you that that's part of his calculation. That's part of the.
I think where I'm struggling is,
Actuary required
I think
contribution.
where I'm struggling is, we're getting a liability study based on actuarial assumptions without the actuary who's the technical advisor to the fund and who is in the best position to understand all of these, all of these imagination.
Well, actually, his
No, and I would have.
ability analysis is in
I'm
there.
not saying that he didn't have a hand in this, but I would have appreciated if he was in the room to explain this, because the actuary's charged by this board and two other boards that hire him and two by extension to be the technical advisor to the funds and to answer any actuarial questions, right? I mean, he's the actuary of the city of New York. I don't see his.
It's informational.
He'll be here at the board if you want to ask.
It's not the first time somebody else has mentioned the
Yeah,
funding ratio.
I'm just trying to understand, Tony, I recognize that. I just want to understand the whole thing, because there's outcomes to this that I don't think are where it's intended to.
Well, if I'm getting tricked, the alchemy of asset allocation can mitigate future risk. That's, I think, the bottom line of this.
Exactly.
That's the bottom line. I don't think this is a controversial statement.
Exactly.
No,
So,
I don't think it's controversial at all.
okay.
The other thing I
I'm
wanted.
excited.
Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is that because the modeling was done a year ago and we expected a sort of trend in the outcome in the column, it's because we are starting off the first year, sort of seeing this weight down on the funding ratio. You're starting at a slightly higher risk starting today. So these results from a year ago, obviously they shift over a little bit. So even though we were 5% down to maybe 3% of seeing such a large contribution risk, it may be up to 5%. That puts things in perspective. That's 20 years down the road. We do the same thing for 30 years. And again, you could look at this in so many different ways, whether it's contribution risk, funding ratio, whichever way it sort of resonates. So what I wanted to mention as well is this, so that sort of summarizes kind of the state of how to look at maybe performance so far and a recap of what liability risk modeling is, what we've done that's sort of unique in that way, what we've taken into account. And maybe in the fall, do another 15 minutes sort of showing how the model performed in 2024, do counterfactual analysis on what would happen if you did or did not do this sort of analysis, show risk assessments based on new income data, auto enrollment, and look at other considerations such as sort of the modeling, any sort of model changes. Again, this is in a pretty advanced stage of peer review in the academic community, the same people who looked at myself doing this sort of modeling for PVGC. So it's pretty well vetted in sort of the pension community. Someone by the name of Fabozzi, some people maybe studied bonds. He wrote a famous textbook on that, has asked that I sort of chime in on sort of the perspective, not of BERS, but just in general of just the state of public pension health. And so some of this stuff is somewhat connected. It's not just kind of done in a vacuum somewhere. And that's really all I have for this perspective on it.
So unfettered, what is the suggestion of the approach? We took private assets off the table and reduced our funding, moved into more,
Yeah, and it was just a little bit, and it was not meant to be a permanent thing, and it's the right thing. It's also the right thing that despite the sort of the news on the reserving side, and what we may have wanted on the outside, is simply to stay the course on the asset allocation. That's the best thing to do, for until the next time.
So we're corroborated in our activity. Is that what you're saying?
Last year, we worked on this together. I mentioned Siegel as well as BAM, and we were able to sort of make the compromises so that, different perspective, that everyone's perspectives, especially the ones that were important. And like I said, we didn't go down that far on private, and in any event, even though it's there, we are still overweight, so.
And the postmortem on the good rapid reduction from 125 to what's the thesis? How did that happen so quickly? Looking back at it.
So about half of it was the drop in the markets. Then we had a drop, and then a couple other adjustments in the more recent frame. But a lot of it is that we do have something that's not unique but rare within BERS, which is the sort of the leveraging within our plan. And so if there's a drop in the market and we're over a certain percentage in funding ratio, we will see a higher sort of beta effect coming off of that and with our obligations. So
look, if I got this correct, so this is where the rebalancing and some of the things that we spoke about in the last couple of months comes into play.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
yeah, it sort of adds to that conversation because it sort of puts things in context. Because I have brought up these points along the way. It's just it sort of puts it into just a revisit so that when you see kind of the end of the year numbers and kind of see a recalibration of the model, at least people haven't totally forgotten what that work was and why it was important.
Am I correct in saying that not only the actuarial assumptions, but when we're making actual investments with asset managers, isn't it something in the contractual language where there's guaranteed a certain amount of return that comes back to the fund on individual investments? Like for instance, if we're sitting now and we negotiate, I know BAM does this with the consultants. If we're negotiating terms of a contract, we're going into an agreement with, say, X asset firm, right? And isn't there something where we guarantee that a certain amount of return is going to come back to, or is it just an overall asset?
There's a hurdle rate that a manager would have to achieve before they could start taking their own payments. And I'll defer to the consultants to explain the mechanics of that. But I think that might be what you're,
Yeah,
and we also, we have targets. Nothing's guaranteed in investing, obviously. We're trying the best that we can to, between the Bureau of Asset Management, the consultants collectively, and the board, we're all trying to find the best managers we possibly can. So we're trying to mitigate risk in that way. There's no guarantees in anything that we do. But I think what you're referring to is the hurdle rate. So there are targets, and again, I don't want to step on the toes of the folks that are experts in this. But if a manager doesn't achieve the hurdle rate, they can't start taking their fee. So they are very motivated to reach that target so that they may get paid.
It's a carry.
They keep just the
Correct.
carry.
Can't take
Yeah,
care.
can't take their carry. But
Yeah.
that's not all
Fee they
they
get
But
either
it's in
way.
the private world, in the equity and fixed income world, that doesn't exist, so
They get a fee either way.
you basically are, paying them a fee. There's not a promised return, so it'll go up and down, so there's not a guarantee of a
Okay.
promised return.
All right.
We're trying on that, we're trying to more and more trying to tie fees into.
Performance, that's what performance fees mean, so when you negotiate a fee, a low kind of like ongoing management fee. And then if the manager, let's say in a 3-year period, outperforms the benchmark by X amount, then they get paid more. But if they underperform, you're paying the bottom, right? The least amount of money to the manager because they're underperforming.
Got it.
There's some hedge funds that will guarantee principal.
So we don't invest in hedge funds in BERS. We don't have hedge funds in BERS. I want to make sure it's clear because I've been asked in every meeting, and in every meeting I've said there's no hedge funds.
Teachers.
So I'm thinking like, I'm looking at C, risk assessment on impacts from new incoming market data and auto enrollment and representing the members without getting into, without knowing the pipeline, I think that it is important for the members, like you mentioned, how to increase, the members or the contributors to their confidence in the pension. And I have this sense that they're really in the dark. Wouldn't know BERS or Borough Asset Management from Brooklyn Academy of Music. And I'm trying to think, what is that intentional? And when it's time for auto enrollment, when it's time to get the members fired up, it's very important to know what's going on in their world. Yeah, granted, we're dealing with long-term investment, right? But their worlds are structured along short-term issues, like housing and low-income earners and not being able to afford to live in the city. And then, as we talked about a few months ago, how do we get members, how do we kind of, I guess, stop them from, is it called buying out? Like taking their money and not really understanding what impact it has to keep it in there because they're in short-term crisis. So I do hope that letter C, as far as how do you get members to auto enroll, and D, other considerations on cash flows, whatever it looks like, I do really hope, as representing the members, that we do see what is happening in their short-term world. So when it's time to really have confidence in these pensions, that's not the first thing to go to take care of some gas bills and light bills and stuff like that. So I would love to see how we're tightening up that conversation around how are we able to inform them, because it's this sense of such disconnect. They do that over there and we do that over here, but what they do impacts this, right? So, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know.
In fact, the members are actually more sensitive than a typical pension beneficiary because of their status, and they're paying a little bit out of their paycheck, which they probably, it's very hard for them to make ends meet and pay this thing for their future. So having confidence in the pension, kind of the health of that, all of that is more sensitive to the members here.
And if I could comment on that, that's where the employee representatives actually come in, John and myself, right? And making sure, I know at our membership meetings, we like to have folks coming from BERS speak to the membership. We also give them as much information as possible on what's happening with the system. I think that's why they elect us to actually be here. So that's why I take it as very serious. I mean, I'm pretty sure John and Frank, them here, they take the information back to their membership as well to inform them of what's happening.
And I'm gonna give a more robust review of auto enrollment crap, but letter campaigns have started, email campaigns will launch in a few weeks. And you have to understand that once people are auto enrolled October 1st, they're in, done.
And I can tell you, we've already received tons of information for those who weren't enrolled. They're receiving tons of information already.
Yeah.
'Cause
All the
I'm
unions are
getting-
involved, DOE's involved.
I'm getting a lot of feedback, and it's positive feedback. Some folks didn't realize that they weren't in the pension, and it's like, hey, after 15 years, I'm gonna do this. Like one lady, she said she received a letter, but as she got the news from us that this was happening, she just enrolled. So she put her paperwork in, but she received the letter and the process is starting, and she was overjoyed. That was just yesterday when I was in the school.
Next question on that. Are you guys prepared for like the people that want to do the buybacks? Because I just thought about that as you said it, Donald.
It's a year.
Like,
They don't qualify for a year, but we've talked about that at the board level. So we see, how the wave hits us. First wave comes, then we have to reach out. So outreach hits. It hits counseling as people want to come in and enroll, auto enroll. We've already got a bunch of people who've enrolled based on what their notification. They're saying, oh crap, I'm not involved.
Yeah.
I'm in first. Call center's getting hit now. It'll get hit again hard in October. We'll auto enroll everyone in October. They don't qualify for borrowing for a year, nor do they qualify for purchasing prior service for a year. So we have a year to staff up to that transaction volume coming. So I've said, you know, we could see a 40% increase in staff here.
So let me ask a quick question, Sandy. It takes a year because we don't have the capacity to do it?
No, legislation. They don't qualify to buy service credit for a year, and they don't qualify to borrow against their contributions for a year.
I can understand the borrowing part. I think, I didn't read the legislation that closely, but I think that's concerning to me that we already took so long to do the auto enrollment. And now that people want to buy in, they have to still wait a year.
Oh, it's 2 years at some plans.
Yeah,
It's
and
like,
it's
yeah,
not,
in the law. I mean,
it
it's-
doesn't-
it's not-
it doesn't necessarily hurt them economically to wait. Because it's, you just have to understand it. Actually, there's an incentive for you to buy your prior service just before you retire.
Depending on how much service.
Yeah, depending on your liquidity, personal
I
liquidity.
was gonna say.
But the math, as the
Math
math
mixes that
works
up.
in almost every system I've been in, you know, you purchase your prior service right at the last minute as you.
And they
plan
can
your
borrow
retirement.
from the TDA to do that, correct?
Exactly.
Right, so there's a tax
Exactly.
benefit available.
Yep.
I hope that we're able to be a bit more diligent with resources, understanding the times that we're in and how to be more proactive with our members. If it's providing other services, understanding their world. I guess this is the non-for-profit person in me. Our job is to be as proactive as possible and not reactive, right? It's easier to deal with a mom who just needs some resources or some links or what have you, opposed to her, you know, whooping a child's ass or something like that. And then all of a sudden I got to buy her Band-Aids. Like, it gets really bad. But the point is that how, with understanding the price of housing, I think we all just need to do a better job in understanding what our worlds look like and our employees every day. What does it look like? And are we just responding to crisis, right? Or what can we do to give employees another alternative opposed to buying out when a crisis hit? What meetings or what type of workshops are we giving them once a month? How do we make this language normal? How do we make it normalized? Like, the pension is the thing we want to do long-term, right? This is what we worked for. And if somebody needs, you know, some type of discount for Brooklyn Union Gas, are we giving them the information they need so they won't tap into their pensions? Like, it's more of a community type of mentality and protecting your employees that I think, you know, is just lacking right now. Just understanding your people, you know, and what they need, and not just responding when something doesn't work.
I think the membership is doing that. Those things, that's what I'm hearing. That's a good point. That's already happening.
Within the limit of the law, Greg.
How's it again?
Within the limit of the law. Once you're in the system, you can't get out, you can't stop.
So
Yeah, I just want to say, I appreciate the presentation that was done. My comments about having the actuary here is because of the auto enrollment. I don't know what the impact is. I know he did a fiscal note, so like, he could actually explain all.
I've talked to him,
all-
yeah,
all
I
that.
understand
So
that.
that's why I'm saying that I would appreciate if he was here to explain all of that, because
Next,
I
next
got-
training, I'll invite him because that's when we'll start looking at the adjustments that I mentioned.
Yeah,
the,
Near-term
the-
jump of
the
about
future-
10% of
The future
contributions.
benefits, yeah.
No, I understand that. I just, you know what I mean? I didn't want to, I may have sounded frustrated. I'm more frustrated that, I had hoped, because there is a fiscal note, this was very well thought out. It was the appropriate, to
This is
do auto
more
enrollment.
what
So I
we
want to make
worked
sure that's
Yeah,
captured.
this is more what we worked on last year, which does not yet include all of those future benefit obligations.
Okay, thank you, Salil. We'll now have to turn to executive session. Before I do that, let me just let the record reflect that Greg Faulkner is here, is present. So do we have a motion to enter into executive session? So move. Greg, do we have a second? Marina Pollen, any discussion on that? Seeing none. All those in favor of moving into executive session, please indicate if you're in favor. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. We are now in executive session. There was a rejection of a OFI fund, approval of a private equity fund, an update on an investment manager, and another investment training. This was the last item on our agenda for today's executive committee meeting. The next scheduled executive committee meeting of the Board of Ed Retirement System is June 27th at 12:30 p.m. May I have a motion to adjourn? Motion, Tony Giordano, second, Karina Pollen. All those in favor, please indicate if you're in favor. Aye. Any opposed and want to stay?
You're standing.
Thank you. This meeting has now been adjourned. See you next.